Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name's Gretchen and today I'm going to be doing another review from the Women's Prize for Nonfiction Longlist, and today's pick is Young Queens by Leah Redmond Chang. Now, I am going to be perfectly honest with you right up front and say that this was not my favorite book. I really struggled with this one, I think for a lot of reasons, and although I think that this book has a lot to offer, and it is by no means a bad book, it just is not the type of book that I gravitate toward. It's not the type of book that I typically get along with, although I am very much a fan of historical books. This one was just a little too dense and a little too heavy for me. And when I say dense and heavy, I'll get into the specifics. It's not the content. I don't think that it was densely written or over my head as far as I'm not smart enough to read this book. It was just complicated and there was a lot going on, and I really struggled to keep facts and things straight throughout the duration of the book, and I'll get more into that in a bit. I think the other reason that I didn't gel very well with this book is that I was probably not in the right headspace for it. I am still not feeling great, and when I was reading it, I was definitely not feeling like myself. I finished it a few days ago, and I could have been, groggy or drowsy from my sinus medication, but I just was not enjoying it at all, and the book actually ended up turning into quite a slog for me. By the time I got to the epilogue, I was over the moon. I was so excited to be toward the finish line, and normally if I start to get to a point where a book is becoming a chore, I will put it down, but I force myself to get through any of the books I promised to read for the long list, because I don't think it's fair for me to review a book that I don't see through to the end, and I wanted to make sure that I did so, and also I made it so far. At that point in time, I would have felt like I was doing myself a disservice if I spent all of this time up front and I didn't see it through to the end. So now I will start getting into some of the specifics of the book, and hopefully you can understand why maybe this book didn't work for me, but it might be a book that you would enjoy. This book follows Catherine de Medici, her daughter Elizabeth de Valois, and Mary Queen of Scots. So the book kind of starts with Catherine's story, and Catherine is born into Italian nobility, and she is orphaned at a young age, and we learn a bit about her story. And then when she is 14 years old, she is married into French royalty, and she marries Henry II. And this marriage took place when both her and Henry were only 14 years old. They eventually start to have children, and we start to talk specifically about her daughter Elizabeth, and then also someone that she took in who just so happened to be Mary Queen of Scots, and she basically raised her as one of her own. And also we learn too about Catherine being the mother to a few kings of France, and although Catherine never ruled on her own, I don't think that she did. She obviously influenced the politics and the way that her three sons ruled France, so she had a lot of power, and the book does a nice job of talking about that and conveying all of the influence that she had on France. And we'll learn more about how she was able to, influence other parts of Europe as well. So I mentioned her daughter Elizabeth, and Elizabeth, she was probably the one that was discussed the least in this book. The stories of Catherine and Mary definitely outshined Elizabeth, and if I'm honest, I feel like we learned more about Elizabeth's husband Philip than we really did about Elizabeth. But once again, that could just be my experience. Speaking of Philip, obviously Catherine is now considered French royalty, and now her daughter is married off to Philip, who is the King of Spain. So now we have French involvement, we have Spanish involvement. Also, not to mention that Catherine had Italian nobility to begin with. So there's a lot going on here and a lot of areas of Europe that are being covered by this single family. And then the last queen that we learn about is Mary, Queen of Scots. When her father died, she was the one that was the heir to the throne. And I think she was only like 5 or 5.5 when that happened. So obviously you can't have a 5.5-year-old ruling Scotland. So Catherine and Henry took Mary under their wing and they raised her. And here we have Mary, who is of Scottish descent, being raised in the French court. And obviously we have Mary, we have Elizabeth, who are fairly close in age, and they become friends and they end up developing a very strong friendship. Although their lives were short, growing up together, they did have a special bond, and they remained friends for the majority of their lives. So the book does get into a lot of detail, and that's just kind of the basic premise of what you're going to get out of this book and what stories are covered and what relationships are going to really be discussed. This book also talks obviously a lot about politics during those years between the different courts in the different countries. It talks a lot about religion and where this book lost me. So all of this stuff to me is interesting. I typically enjoy historical books like this, and I really tend to be fascinated by a lot of this. Where I got lost is I think that this book was way too ambitious and it covered way too much content for a reader like me to absorb all at once. So anytime we start talking about royalty and lineage and different courts from different countries and politics during that time, all of the people that are involved start to get really, really confusing, especially because a lot of them share the same names. So you have Philip II, Philip III, you have Charles I, you have Charles IV, you have Henry II, you have Henry VIII. Like, you have all of these different people, and it gets very confusing very quickly. I felt so many times during this book that I needed to just take all of the pictures off of one of my walls in my house and just do like this murder board with all of these pictures of all of these different people and just get the string out and start connecting them. And it was just way too complicated. And not only were we talking about the prime characters, but we were learning about their husbands, their children, parents, rivals. We were learning about all of these other people, and it felt like every time I turned the page, we were being introduced to another person that I had to keep straight, and it was too much for me to handle, and I was really starting to get frustrated because I feel like when you start to get to that point where you're just introducing all of these different people, we're starting to lose focus of what the point of the book was. And I think what the point of the book was is to talk about those three women and how their lives were interwoven and how they impacted each other, and the stories of their legacy, and really focus on their relationship. I'm not saying that the book didn't do that, it did, but it also brought in a whole bunch of other stuff as well. And there are certainly going to be readers out there that appreciate or love the book for that exact reason, but I'm just not one of them. Perhaps I'm just not smart enough to keep all of those things straight in my head, but I really like to be able to read a book and not have to keep stopping and going back to my notes to remember how these two people are connected, or we're talking about this person again. Okay, let me go back to my list and find that person and figure out who they are, so now I can continue to follow along with the story. It was just a little too much for my little brain to handle. And the other thing, and this is usually part of what I like about books like this, it was fascinating in the sense that I really do love stories like this. So I was shocked that I didn't mesh very well with this one, because I love how messy things used to be back in the day. All the conniving, all of the backstabbing, all of the treachery, all of the horrible things that these people used to do to each other. And I love that because it does seem very much like a Days of Our Lives soap opera. For those of you that are in the UK, kind of like a Hollyoaks type thing, where you've got all these different families, you've got all these different side stories, and it's messy, and people are just awful, but then people are great, and you know, it's love, hate, it's all of those different things. And I usually really appreciate stories like that, and I like them, but it was just very frustrating for me. And I don't want that to take away from the book itself, because I can appreciate that the author did a ton of research. She did her homework, and the book was written very well. The language and the writing was very pretty, and it was flowery as one would expect any book about royals to be. My other complaint about this book is it was so long. It was 512 pages, I think, and I'm not against reading big chunky books. I like big chunky books, but it was a lot of pages of very complicated stories to keep together, and I could have probably kept my brain power up for about 300, 350, but beyond that, I really started to just break down and shut down, and really started to lose any interest that I had in the story, because I was just getting tired and I was getting bored. There was a lot of repetition. There were also a lot of parts of it that were not necessary, and I know why the author put them in there, because it did add some nuance to the story, but it wasn't necessary in telling the story. For example, I remember this part where she was talking about buttons, like these little carved buttons, and it had really nothing to do with the overall point of the story, but we were taking a few paragraphs to talk about these buttons, and there were a lot of things like that throughout this book, and I know that it added to the beauty of the story, but in a book that was already complex and had a lot going on, that just added to my frustration. I was was reading and I kept thinking, is this something important that I'm going to have to remember for the future? Or is this just a trivial little piece of knowledge that the author found that she's just trying to find some place within the story to shove it in? And that was another frustrating part of this book for me. I definitely think there's an audience for this out there. I think that anybody that really loves this type of history, you are probably going to be the best group of readers that are going to enjoy this. I personally do enjoy this type of history, but after reading a book like this, I think that my preferred platform for enjoying stuff like this is probably going to be documentary style movies or series about things like this, where I need more visuals, I need more time between episodes maybe to let everything that just happened sink in, everything that was provided to me sink in before I move on to the next one. I've been reading the long list for this prize, and I've usually been reading each book within a day or a day and a half. I'm a fast reader, that's not uncommon for me, and this book actually took me about 10 days to get through, which is very unusual for me. I can't remember the last time it took me 10 days to read a single book that was not intentional. Like, I'm reading Les Mis right now, but I'm reading a chapter a day, and I'm doing that intentionally because I'm reading it very deeply. Maybe I needed to take a month with this book, and if I did and I read it slower and I let everything process more and ruminate more, then I would have had a better experience with it. I think that there are so many other books that I have read so far that are doing new things, and to me, this is just another run-of-the-mill historical book, and I don't think that it's really doing anything special, but once again, that could just be me being grumpy and hating on the book, but yeah, this one just wasn't for me. I am still going to give it a 3 though, because I can appreciate all of the time and the effort that went into writing it. I know that it was written well, I know that it was researched well, and I know that there is definitely going to be an audience for this, and perhaps somebody that already has a baseline knowledge of those 3 women and already knows a little bit about the history of Europe during that time, during these monarchies, is going to maybe walk away from this book thinking that it's fantastic. So we are almost halfway through all of the long listed books. I have a couple more that I finished that I'll be putting reviews out for soon. Even though this wasn't my favorite, I'm still really satisfied with how things are going, and I think that there's bound to be a couple books in any long list that just aren't going to be for a reader, and I hope that I got, the worst one for me personally out of the way, and I'm really looking forward to my next couple reads, and until we read again, bye!